Hello. Uh, Today is our second week in Dynamic and Group Process course. As we all discussed last week, uh, what is group dynamic and also what are the main focus of the study. Yeah. Today we are going to learn about how scholars in group dynamic investigate the process that are exist in group process. Yeah. There are several measurements that are usually being used by scholars in group dynamic fields. Yeah, they are observation and self-report. Yeah, observation is a measurement method that involves watching and recording individual and group actions, while self-report measures are usually used to record how individual responds to a series of statement or question, yeah, in related to processes that involve in group. Yeah, one of the example that one of the example of self-report measures is sociometry. Yeah. I will show you what is sociometry in the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so what are observation? There are several type, yeah, if we can say like that. There are several type of observation that usually being used by scholars in investigating the process in a group, yeah, or group process, yeah. The type of observation are overt observation, covert observation, and participant observation, yeah. Overt observation means that the researchers, yeah, is openly watching and recording group behavior with no attempt to conceal one's research purpose. So the researchers is observing the process that are happen in a group, yeah, and also observing the behavior of the group member, yeah, but with no attempt to conceal the purpose of the research, yeah. That's overt observation. The next type of observation is that are used, yeah, is covert observation. Covert observation is involving watching and recording group behavior without the participants' knowledge, yeah. So in overt observation, the group that are studied, that are being investigated, yeah, aware of the presence of the observer. While in the covert observation, the group member or the group that being investigated doesn't aware of the presence of the observer. Yeah, that's the difference between the overt and covert. Yeah. And the next type of observation that are being used in group dynamic research is participant observation, which is watching and recording group behavior while taking part in the social process. So in this type of observation, the observer is not only watching and observing the behavior of the member in the group, yeah, or the process that happen in group, but the observer also involved, yeah, and taking part uh, in the activities that are held or happen in the group, yeah. There are, of course, certain limitation, yeah, in the application, yeah, of observation as a measurement, yeah, in group dynamic. Yeah, the limitation is known as Hawthorne effect. Yeah, Hawthorne effect is a change in behavior that occurs when individuals know they are being studied by researchers. Yeah, so for example, when the observer observing how a group member behave in response to, for example, in response to a certain role, for example, yeah, then because they are aware that they are observed by the observer, so they tend to behave they tend to obey, yeah, we can say like that. They tend to obey the instruction that are being given, yeah, by the observer, because it's not because they are willing to obey, yeah, but because they are aware that they are being observed, yeah. And this is one of the example of Hawthorne effect. Yeah. There are several research, yeah, that use observations, yeah. The example are the interaction process analysis, or APA, that used to classify group behavior into task-oriented and relationship-oriented categories. And also one of the examples that are using observation is SIMLOG. Yeah, SIMLOG is systematic multiple level observation of group, and SIMLOG are used to classify group activities. Yeah, these two investigation or study, IPA and SIMLOG, is using observation as its method. Yeah, to measures the process that are happen or exist in group. The next measurement tool that are used usually in studied group process is self-report. Yeah, self-report is an assessment method such as a questionnaires, a test, or interview that ask respondents to describe their feelings, attitudes, or belief. Yeah. The example of self-report, yeah, in group dynamics or sociometry, yeah. Sociometry is a research technique developed by Jacob Moreno, yeah, that graphically and mathematically summarize patterns of intermember relations, yeah. And the next example that are using a self-report, yeah, to study group process is sociogram. Sociogram is a graphic representation of the patterns of intermember relation created through sociometry. So the sociometry is the graphic, yeah. So the researchers try to identify the patterns, yeah, of intermember relations and draw the relation on a sociometry, yeah. While the sociogram is the graphic representation. So it's like the continuation of the sociometry technique, yeah. So after identify the patterns, then the researchers made the sociometry. Then the researchers' next step is building the sociogram of the pattern. Yeah. Okay, this is the example of sociogram. Yeah, you can see here. This is showing the patterns of relationship between one member and another. Yeah. So you can see here that Manson and Hitler are having a close relationship, yeah, compared to Manson and Arafat, yeah. And this pattern, yeah, when it turns into a graph. Yeah, it become the patterns is identified by sociometry, and then the researchers built this sociogram based on the sociometry, based on the pattern, yeah, that already identified in sociometry. Okay, now move to the next thing. We've just learned about measurement tool that usually being used by scholars, yeah, in the field of group dynamic, yeah. And now we move to the next discussion, which is research design in group dynamic, yeah. There are several research design that usually used by scholars, yeah, in investigating the process that are happen in a group, yeah. Research design that are usually used are case study, yeah, experimental studies, and correlational studies. Case study is a research technique that involves examining, yeah, in as much detail as possible, the dynamics of a single group or individual, yeah. While the experimental studies is a research design, yeah, in which the investigator manipulates at least one variable by randomly assigning participants to two or more different conditions and measuring at least one other variable. While correlational study is a research design in which the investigator measures but doesn't manipulate, yeah, at least two variables, and then use statistical procedures, yeah, to examine the strength and direction of the relationship between these variables. Yeah. So there are three, we can say three research design that usually being used by scholars in group dynamic. Yeah. As I've already described, yeah, case study is a technique, yeah, a research technique that examine one single group, yeah, in this context, one single group, yeah. In the context of group dynamic, of course, one single group, yeah. And one of the example that are using case study is investigation that are held on the under survivor case, yeah. Under survivor case is it's a famous, yeah, famous study. Even they make the movie, yeah, in related to under survivor, yeah. It's based on the real case, real what we call a real, not real story, yeah, but it's happened. It's really happened, yeah. There are plane crash, yeah, and then the plane crash and land in an Andes mountain, yeah. And there are several people that are survived from the crash and they are still alive, and some of them died, but some of them is still alive, and they are trying to survive after the crash. After the plane is crashed, they are trying to survive, yeah, and to survive and keep themselves alive, yeah, and while they are waiting for help from the rescue team, yeah, they form a group, yeah. In this case study, yeah, it is learned that it is learned about a group formation and about norm, about role, yeah, about also about leadership, yeah. So in this investigation of undead survivor is one of the example of study that using case study research approach. Yeah. So researcher choose one what we call it one case, yeah, and then they studied the case, yeah. So the next research design that also implement, yeah, by scholars in group dynamic is experimental studies, yeah. In experimental studies, the researchers manipulates at least one variable. So there are manipulations in the experimental studies. One of the examples that are famous is milligram experiment. Yeah, you've already read, yeah, about milligram experiment, right? And perhaps some of you also made it as one of your assignment that are submit, yeah, last week. Yeah, okay. So that's the example of experimental studies. So researchers need to manipulate at least one variable, yeah, and then investigate the influence of the manipulation of certain variables into yeah, the effect of the manipulation that are applied to a certain variable to other variable. Yeah. The next thing is correlational studies. Yeah. Correlational studies also involving at least two variable, but the difference is the difference between experimental and correlational studies is, while for experimental, the researcher need to manipulate, yeah, one variable, while for correlational studies, there is no manipulation. So researchers doesn't need to manipulate anything. Researchers only try to find or investigate the relationship between one variable to other variable. Yeah. Okay. That's all the research design that usually being implemented by researchers in the field. Yeah. So from this process, from the investigation that are applied by scholars in the group dynamic process, then they form or they what we call it, the outcome of the process is then a theory. Yeah. There are several line of theories, yeah, that result as a study, yeah, that result from the study that are yeah, that are produced, yeah, by the scholars in group dynamic. Yeah. The first perspective, yeah, theoretical perspective is motivational model. Yeah. The example, the theory that use or that based on motivational model is Lewin level of aspiration theory. Yeah. And the next perspective is behavioral approach. Yeah. And the example of theory that are based on behavioral approach is Skinner social exchange theory. Yeah. And the next perspective is system theory. Yeah. And the example of the theory that are based on system theory is complexity theory. And then the next perspective is cognitive approach. Yeah. And the cognitive approach, the theory that discuss about group understanding is example of the theory that applied cognitive approach. And the last perspective is biological approach. So we are going to discuss each of the perspective. Yeah. The first perspective is motivational model. Yeah. So according to this perspective, wants, needs, and other psychological processes that energize behavior and thereby determine its form, intensity, and duration. So, motivational model argued, yeah, that behavior, yeah, is determined the form, intensity, and duration of behavior, yeah, especially in group process, yeah, is influenced by wants, needs, and other psychological process that are happen in the individual, yeah, in the persons, yeah. The example is group affective tone, yeah, the theory that discussed about group affective tone, yeah, or the collective emotional mood of a group. So it's related to how a group emotional nuance, yeah, or emotional conditions of a group, yeah. A certain group have a certain emotional mood, yeah, and this group affective, this is called by group affective tone, and this group affective tone is one of the example of theory that based on motivational model, yeah. So move to the next perspective is behavioral approach, yeah. Behavioral approach is a theoretical explanations of the way organisms acquire new responses to environmental stimuli through such conditioning process as stimulus response association and reinforcement. Yeah, and the example is social exchange theory. Social exchange theory is an economic model of interpersonal relationship which argues that individuals seek out relationships that offer them many rewards while uh, extracting few costs. Yeah. So, social exchange theory understanding of interpersonal relationship, yeah, between members is based on a behavior approach, which is based on the stimulus response associations. That's why if we see from the conclusion of social exchange theory, we can see that individuals' interpersonal relationship, yeah, is determined by the reward and punishment mechanism, yeah. And we can see from the conclusion that are stated by social exchange theory that individuals seek out relationship that offer rewards, yeah, maximum reward, yeah, and minimum cost, yeah. And this is based on stimulus response association. Therefore, social exchange theory is, we can say that social exchange theory is one of the example of theory that based on behavioral approach. Yeah. Okay, move to the next perspective is system theory. Yeah. System theory is a general theoretical approach which assumes that groups or system. Yeah, a group is a system. System is a collection of individual units that combine to form an integrated complex whole. So, according to system theory, a group is not a element, is not a part of element, but it's a system. Yeah, it's a collection of individual unit. Yeah, and that shape complex and become a whole. Yeah. And the example of theory that using this perspective is input process output or IPO model. Yeah. Any one of a number of general conceptual analysis of group IPO assume that group process mediate the relationship between individual, group, and situational input variable and resulting group outcome. So IPO model see dynamic in a group as a whole, not divided as a divided parts. Yeah. So it's assumed that group process, yeah, is involved in the relationship between individual and individual, between individual and a group as a whole, and also individual and situational variable. Yeah. So the next perspective is cognitive approach. Yeah. Cognitive approach focus on mental process, yeah, that acquire, organize, and integrate information. So in theory that are based on cognitive approach, they usually focus on the mental process that are exist in a group. Yeah. And one of the example of theory that apply this approach is self-categorization theory. Self-categorization theory argues that individuals tend to categorize themselves and others into a group that have certain characteristic, same characteristic. Yeah. So the process to categorize, yeah, the mental process to categorize themselves and other into group that have certain similarities is based on a cognitive approach. Yeah. Okay. So we just now learn about motivational perspective, yeah, and the example and the theory that the example of theory that based on motivational perspective, and then we also learn about behavioral perspective and the theory that are based on behavioral perspective, and then also we learn about system perspective, yeah, and also the theories that lies on the perspective, and then just now we've learned about cognitive approach, yeah, or cognitive perspective, and also the example of theory that are based on cognitive approach, yeah. Next, and the last approach or perspective that are exist in a group dynamic is biological approach, yeah. Biological approach, yeah, focus on how individual, yeah, responds to the environment, yeah, and it's closely related to if you perhaps previously learned during your senior high school or even junior, perhaps you've already in touch, yeah, with Darwin evolutionary theory. So biological approach is basically based on Darwin evolutionary theory. That's why this perspective focus on how individual respond and adapt to the environment. Yeah, and this perspective believe that group members are also living creatures whose responses are often shaped by biological, biochemical, and genetic characteristics. Yeah. And the example of a theory that based on biological approach is evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a biological approach to understand behavior, which assume that recurring patterns of behavior in animals ultimately stem from evolutionary processes that increase the likelihood of adaptive social action and extinguish non-adaptive practice. So evolutionary psychology focused on how individual could adapt, in a certain or in response to their surrounding, and in this group dynamic, of course, in a group settings, Okay, so today we've already discussed about study in group dynamic, We've learned about the measurement tool that are usually used by scholars in the field. We also learn about the method, the research method that are applied, and also we've learned about the perspective that lies behind the theory, in a group dynamics, Okay, I think we've already covered a main topic, that we need to understand in this meeting, and we can continue to discuss. If you have a further question, we can continue to discuss on WhatsApp, WhatsApp group, or or you can send me an email if you want to discuss personally, Okay, thank you for listening, and see you. Take care. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum.